It's great to welcome back to the program today Steve Almond, who's the author of the New York Times bestsellers Candy Freak and Against Football. The new novel is called All the Secrets of the World, and you can find him on Twitter at Steve Almond Joy. Steve, great to have you back on today.
Yeah, good to be with you, David.
So we reviewed in the aftermath of this horrible incident that took place on the NFL field with Damar Hamlin, your appearance with Fox News host Laura Ingraham, where you pointed out some of the things she has previously said on her program, which she didn't particularly like. And there was so much that took place in that interview, and I know many in our audience really appreciated it. So let's just start at something very, very top level. What happened with Damar Hamlin was very visible in the sense that it happened at a very particular moment in a game. He suffered a cardiac arrest during a game, and that makes it a much more interesting media story because it has a sort of beginning, a middle, and presumably some end where he's now been released from the hospital and so on and so forth. The truth is, and you've been writing about how there's a much slower motion story that afflicts many other players that doesn't lend itself to this beginning, middle, end of, hey, it happened during the game, which is the brain injury and the cumulative effect of football. Talk a little bit about how the media reaction is so dramatically different to what took place on the field over a week ago versus that bigger story.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like you saw in the appearance with Ingram, I basically said, hey, there are these big media events that, the reason I'm even snuck onto your fascist network is because, let's find a libtard who hates football. It's that kind of zero-sum thinking, propagandist thinking.
Yeah.
And I tried to sort of calmly say to her, the NFL's own actuaries did admit that 30% of their players are going to wind up with brain damage because of the accretion of these subconcussive events, invisible inside the helmet, thousands of them absorbed over a career. And literally, they cause brain damage in this major American workplace. And you sort of said it before her, like, what if 30% of Fox News were getting brain damage? I think actually they're giving brain damage.
Right.
But what if by design? But I think, what if this was in another American workplace, and just try to set out for her the monstrous double standard that applies when it comes to football, that there's this workplace where literally a third of the employees are going to get, and it's just crickets. It's like no reaction to that at all. And it's because, and I think that's actually writ large, the media's general reaction. It's a complicated story. It's a story that's happening out of view. And in fact, the NFL paying off that lawsuit, settling it, is precisely what the NFL wanted to happen. Their nightmare is Junior Seau's family, or Mike Webster's family, or any of these guys, even Tony Dorsett, famous players and their families talking about what it's like to live with CTE. They just want none of that in the public eye. And they're content, I think, in a sense, with the Damar Hamlin story, because that is, as you point out, that's going to be very satisfying. He's getting better. The medical, he recovered, and thank God he's getting better. But let's step back and say, literally, for every Damar Hamlin, there is another player who is in his 40s or 50s or 60s who doesn't know where he is, who doesn't recognize his family anymore, who suffered permanent cognitive decline and brain damage, and that's happening out of view. And I think that's kind of the deal that Americans make. If I can't see it, really, in a sense, what's fascinating to me, David, a lot of businesses are in the empathy suppression business. And that's what the NFL is in. It's in the empathy suppression. And their players have to suppress their empathy, but also by implication, the fans also have to suppress their empathy. They have to really occlude their moral imagination so that they cannot imagine that scenario. And that's how I think we continue to be able to consume stuff that's really destructive, whether it's a football game or hamburger, whatever it is. We ignore the slaughterhouse and we take a big bite of the bacon cheeseburger. That's kind of the big deal of American capitalism. And when you try to connect those dots and say, I know you can't see it. I know that in your fragile mindset, we're hiding from you all the child labor that makes our miraculous devices. I think most Americans, myself included to a large extent, agree to that. It's a kind of complicity because we don't want to look at the underside of these complicated moral undertakings. It's too complicated, it's too nuanced, and it's too psychologically and emotionally inconvenient.
And with, I think you can find in other sports not exactly analogous circumstances, but moral questions that come up, maybe we can say. I mean, with the World Cup in Qatar,
Right.
for a decade, I talked about corruption was how it even ended up in Qatar, slave labor and death in terms of the building of the stadiums, claims that there's going to be kosher food, but then then all of a sudden there's no kosher food, and it's based on, the religious perspective, all these different things. And then at the end of the day, I'm from Argentina, and every 4 years I want to see if maybe we're going to get a win, and we finally got it, and I watch the games, right? At the end of the day, I watch the games. Am I making a moral trade there in some sense? I mean, I guess I kind of am, but it feels like it's a different one than with football, because I don't know. I mean, what's different about the Qatar World Cup thing and then saying football's bad for the players' brains, but I really enjoy it, I'm going to watch it anyway?
Well, I think they're the same. It's the same cognitive dissonance. And I guess what I tried to do in Against Football was not say football's dumb and brutal and you shouldn't, consume it because it's misogynistic and, systemically racist and blah, blah, blah. I didn't, I think those things happen to be true. And it's also a remarkable spectacle. And it's also, what's happening in the culture, and therefore a way to feel connected to it, or you have a personal connection to your team. And those two things have to live side by side. And what I think the media tries to do is sort of partition them out and say, well, it's time for your 5 minutes of moral contemplation and anguish, and now it's time for your 3 hours of game.
Right.
And I think it's very uncomfortable when people have to live with this sort of negative capability that two opposing thoughts have to be held in the mind and heart at the same time. But that's like what adults are doing all the time if they're living, sort of awake in some way. And I think it's partly what Fox and other propaganda outlets are in the business of trying to suppress. They want everything to be either or. It's never both and. And so, when I come on the Ingram show, the Chiron, which I couldn't see, of course, because I'm sitting in a little van just staring at a black dot with Laura Ingram interrupting me in my ear. But what I see later on is they're trying to turn you off to football. That's what the Chiron reads. And it's just this classic, how can we make you afraid? Who's trying to, how can we exalt your grievance so that you can hide from your own vulnerabilities? We will help you with that. And what to me is really sad is the sense that there isn't an opportunity. Like I go on the Ingram show and I realize we're not going to have a serious discussion. At a certain point I go, okay, I'm going to take my shots here because you're not going to actually be in a good faith dialogue with me about how complicated football is, that it can be beautiful and bonding and blah, 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 and narratively very satisfying. And at the same time that it's got a set of values and practices that are just inherently corrupt. And that is not ever going to be the discussion that I can have with her. So we just get into a brawl, which is really just sort of feeding the angertainment industry that she's in. But there does exist a world, or there used to in media, where that was really literally the rule of the fairness doctrine. Said you cannot have a single outlet that just puts out one idea or philosophy or set of propaganda. You have to have the essence of free speech is sort of different shades of opinion, reasonable opinion coming up against one another. That's the reason I lament the death of the fairness doctrine, because it created the opportunity for somebody like Laura Ingram or Tucker Carlson or any of these propagandists to be challenged in real time and to not just be able to blather basically what I view to be kind of brainwashing propaganda at their audience with nobody having a chance to say, hold on, Laura, you just said that only certain kids, the only path out for certain kids in America is by playing football. Are you admitting that there's systemic racism in this country that disadvantages kids of color and especially poor kids of color? It sounds like that's what you're saying to your audience. Can we have a discussion about that as well?
That's not a conversation that is easy to imagine happening in good faith on Fox News, as you point out. In terms of football, I believe I correctly understand that recently football ratings are down to some degree. And there are those on the political right in the United States that say it's because of the kneeling and the woke and, the stuff that they say about it. Do you think that the brain injury, awareness of the brain injury component is a factor, or is it just the fragmentation of audiences as there are more and more alternatives to watching live sports, that is really what is to blame? Or is it hard to know? Is it a combination?
Yeah, I don't know. And I think probably on the margins, there are some people who were sort of marginal football fans who have either stopped watching or maybe cut back their consumption. But it's still the biggest thing in America.
Mm.
And I think the Hamlin injury happening at the time it did became such a huge story because it's a Monday night game, because it's two teams that were really good. The ratings were really high. And I just have the feeling, as I was trying to sort of explain, like football's not going to go away because the government's going to ban it. Football's not going to go away because the woke mob is going to take it away. That's part of the old, they're going to take your guns, they're going to take your hamburgers, they're going to take your God, they're going to
your
kill
gas stoves now is the new one.
Right. Well, right. It's like this idea of if you try to make any moral improvement in the culture, we've got to frame it, since it's the enemy of our business interests, we got to frame it as some sort of assault on your personal liberty or your prerogatives or privilege. And I think football is going to diminish in popularity only at such a time as enough fans sort of say, I think there are other things that I can consume that are narratively satisfying to me, that don't cause me to come up against my own sense of maybe I'm rubbernecking people getting brain damage. And those wires are really hard to connect. There's a great book that was written by a former NFL player years ago, and he said, I dream of a day in which football isn't necessary for the American culture. Because I really do think there's a direct line between kind of the reason that America is not able to put sensible gun control measures into place, the reason that our sort of popular culture is awash in all these images of violence, and our video games, and our and football. I think there is like this underlying kind of need to purge our aggressive impulses and to kind of consume that violence that I think there's a through line there. Nobody wants to connect those dots, but it's not a coincidence that most of the world watches football, that is soccer.
Yes.
And our big sport is American football, which is just, I know people try to what about with hockey and this, that, and the other. And it's like, okay, yeah, any sport can have its dangers. But baked into football is really big, strong, fast guys smashing into one another. It's hidden underneath the helmets and the uniforms. But if those behaviors were happening outside the context of football, I'd be like, oh, yeah, that's aggravated battery.
Is there a way to make football safer in the sense of, you read about, well, you can have sensors in helmets which can track cumulative sort of impact on a player during a game, and then in theory you could pull them out once some threshold has been reached, or all these different ideas. On one level, it's like when your brain changes direction that quickly, doesn't matter how thick the helmet is, it's the brain hitting against the skull to some degree. So, like, can football actually be football and be safer to the players?
Well, it's kind of what you're saying. Like when you say football, I think what you're implying is that there's a certain amount of risk, going back to like Cormac McCarthy sort of saying, like, what is it that we get off on? And it's basically kind of the risk, the big hit. We don't want to admit it, but there's a primal sense of these guys are putting their life on the line. And why are they lionized? Because they can survive and play through injury. Because there's something real that I think is lacking somehow in our lives, probably, that's like this primal atavistic need to see other people play out a kind of danger that we're insulated from. So I don't think there's any way around the fans' unacknowledged but powerful lust for other people to risk on their behalf. I think that's just part of like the modern condition. I do think that if there were financial incentives, IBID, the Fox sexual harassment, like only, a corporation that makes a lot of money only changes, or a particular demagogue like Laura Ingraham, they only change their tune when they're hit in the pocketbook. The only way the NFL is going to change their behavior is if fans change their behavior first. And there are plenty of things that could happen, as I tried to point out, like tomorrow. Weight limits would be one way, since these players are now average, 270 pounds. well, what if they weren't bulking up in the gym? And what if, in fact, they were, 200 pounds? It's not going to cure it, but it would decrease the amount of impact and the G forces, the amount those brains are shaking around. Putting monitors in helmets would create a different set of incentives, because suddenly players, like a pitcher with a pitch count, suddenly a player would be saying, I am not going to go in with my helmet, or I'm not going to partake in a big hit, because if I do that, I'm going to be pulled out of the game because it's bad for my brain. They
Mm,
don't want the fans thinking about that.
right.
Again, the big goal of the NFL is to keep the dots unconnected. And they have like a willing accomplice in Fox and the right wing in this country, which essentially says implicitly or explicitly, a buffoon like Trump says it explicitly, like, oh, yeah, football, it's like a man's game. Now it's sissies. They throw the flag all the time. What they're basically saying is like, I'm into violence. I know I'm personally a wimp who tries to get out of the military and avoid conflict, but I get off on watching other people be violent.
Right. Steve, last thing in the limited time we have left, you mentioned the fairness doctrine. One of the difficulties, I think, of a reinstatement of the fairness doctrine now is that so much of what we now are consuming wouldn't be subject to the fairness doctrine as it previously existed because it's on the internet. Would you want to see something specific applied to the internet when it comes to that, or is that a different question?
Well, I honestly think that if you have the power, I mean, the fairness doctrine came into being because in the early 20th century, something happened that the founders could not have foreseen, right, David? What happened is mass media. And some, people in Congress who were smart said, oh my God, there's now this tool that can sway the hearts and minds of Americans. And if it falls into the wrong hands, hands that are avaricious and only interested in business, or even worse, that have a kind of moral agenda that's inimical to democracy, that would be terrible. We can't let that happen. We have to have some form of regulation. And people, of course, on the right and greedy people freak out about that because propaganda, as you know, is it sells, right? Ingram and Tucker and all those people, they are fear mongers for a living and they make a tremendous amount of money doing it. The fairness doctrine said, look, that is, if we're going to have debates, it's important that media cover and participate in debates of issues that are publicly important, but they have to do so in a way that includes all reasonable shade of opinion. That's what's in the Supreme Court decision, all reasonable shade of opinion. Now, I happen to find a lot of the outright lies and innuendo and insinuation that demagogues traffic in to not be reasonable shades of opinion. But whatever, I'm even cool with having those propagandists do their thing. I just want somebody like you or me to have equal time to say, Laura, when you say that only certain kids are going to make it through football, what you are admitting is that America is systemically racist against people of color, and we do not give them schools and social workers and economic opportunity in their communities. What we give them is like the lottery ticket of maybe you can find your way out, not by the content of your character or your intelligence or creativity, but because you're really good at throwing a ball and getting tackled and eventually getting brain damage for my benefit as a cosseted little, wimpy person sitting on my couch, getting off on the risk that you and that your body assumes. So like, that's what I want, is for people like Tucker and Laura Ingraham to stop being such cowards, hiding in their little media silos, plowing out their propaganda to fearmonger and brainwash their audience. Because I really have a personal stake in this. People in my life who are important to me or used to be important to me no longer think in a reasonable way. They've been scared out of their wits, literally. And I think a lot of families, Trumpism is the symptom of this. But I think a lot of American families would be like, you know what, we would be so much healthier and our family systems would be so much healthier if there wasn't propaganda allowed on any side,
Right.
but especially on the right, where I think it's all about exalting people's grievance so that people can hide from their fears and their vulnerabilities, like the stuff that we have to solve and work out if we're going to solve climate change and inequity and the violence that besets the culture, all these very real problems. We can't do that if we are allowing allowing media to become a for-profit marketplace. It's not. It's supposed to be a civic institution. It's not supposed to be a for-profit segment.
Yeah, and as a topic tangential to this, you mentioned the grievance component, while all at the same time saying it's the left that has become about grievance, which is just another instance of the projection that we're seeing. But that'll have to be a topic for another day. Steve Almond, the new novel is All the Secrets of the World. You can find him on Twitter at Steve Almond Joy. Steve, always great to talk to you.
Hey, David, it's a delight to talk with you. And the thing about the fairness doctrine, which we're going to finally get restored at some point, is you would be fabulous. I want to see a David Pakman sitting in the same dais with one of these propagandists and saying, look, I do not consent to the false narrative that you're weaving. Like, that's my dream.